AITAH for wanting to divorce my husband after he named our newborn son after the last name of his female boss behind my back? When I opened the envelope with my son's birth certificate, I was prepared to see something familiar. Something that honored my past, my family, and, most of all, my beloved grandfather. I felt such a blend of love, pride, and excitement, ready to frame it, hold it as a cherished memento of the beautiful future we were going to build with our son. Then, in a matter of seconds, my feelings turned to confusion. I could feel my face fall as I stared at the name printed there, not the one we'd spent months discussing. It was like a switch had flipped inside me, and disbelief took over. I knew what we had agreed upon, the name we'd lovingly chosen together. And yet, there, in plain ink, was a name I didn't recognize. A name I had never once considered. A name that had absolutely nothing to do with our family or our life together. The name was familiar to me, of course, but for all the wrong reasons. It was the last name of my husband's boss, a woman whose presence in our lives had always felt distant yet present. Like some off-stage character who never quite joined the main scene but whose influence was felt nonetheless. There had been occasional stories about her, casual mentions, but nothing to suggest any deep connection. I'd assumed she was just another boss, someone he had to tolerate or navigate to get through the day. Now, that name had somehow become the identity on my child's birth certificate. For a few moments, I tried to convince myself that there had been a mistake, that maybe someone had typed in the wrong information, mixed up a detail. After all, there are hundreds of steps in processing birth records, and anyone could slip up. But as I held the certificate in my hands and examined every detail, it was unmistakable that the name printed there was not an error. It was deliberate, a choice that had been made without my knowledge or consent, and it felt like a betrayal etched right there in black and white. I sat down, still gripping the certificate. My mind was whirling with questions, each one flashing through my head faster than I could process. Why would he do this? Why take away something so deeply personal to me? Something that meant more to me than he could ever know? And why replace it with a name that, as far as I knew, held no meaning for us as a couple, at least. None that I was aware of? I wanted to call someone, talk it out, maybe even laugh it off. But it didn't feel like a laughing matter. Instead, I sat there, staring at the name, trying to accept the truth that was staring back at me. This wasn't some clerical error or a typo. This was a decision, a choice he'd made, and not just any choice, but one he'd made behind my back about our own child. I felt something shift inside me, like the earth cracking open just a little. As the hours passed, my initial shock gave way to a simmering anger. Every time I looked at that birth certificate, the name felt like an insult, a mockery of everything we'd been building together. I kept asking myself how he could do this to me, to us, to the child we were supposed to be raising together. When my husband walked through the door that evening, he looked tired, as he often did, but there was a subtle hint of relief in his expression, as if whatever had happened that day at work had been taxing. And now he was finally home to rest. I wanted to feel that same relief, to share in the comfort of our home and our new family. But instead, I felt a growing storm inside me. I didn't want to explode. I didn't want to turn this into a scene. So, I decided to start simple, careful, and controlled. When he settled in, I handed him the birth certificate. Is this right? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked down at it, and for a split second, his face was blank, unreadable. Then he nodded, nonchalant, as if he had forgotten it would even be a question. Yeah, that's the name I put, he said, almost dismissively, as if it were no big deal. Like this was something he had every right to decide on his own. I took a deep breath. Why did you change it from what we agreed on? He looked at me, surprised, like I had asked a question about the weather. I just thought it was a nice name, he replied, brushing it off as casually as if he were choosing a restaurant for dinner. There was no remorse, no guilt, nothing to suggest he understood what he'd done. I wanted to shake him, to force him to understand the weight of what he'd taken from me. But instead, I clung to my last thread of calm. So, you just changed it, without telling me? I could hear the anger slipping into my voice. My words sharper than I intended. He shrugged. I didn't think you'd mind. It's just a name. Just a name? The words came out louder than I intended, echoing in the quiet of the living room. I could feel my patience wearing thin, fraying with each second he acted like this was no big deal. We had a name picked out. It meant something to me, something to us. And you just replaced it with your boss's name, of all things? He hesitated for a moment. The first real pause since we'd started talking. But then, as quickly as the hesitation appeared, it vanished, replaced by a defensiveness I hadn't anticipated. What's the big deal? He asked. Exasperated. It's just a name, and you're making it sound like I did something terrible. I thought it would be a strong name. A good choice. A good choice? Do you even hear yourself? My voice cracked, the weight of betrayal sinking in. You made a decision about our child without me. And you didn't even choose some random name. You chose the name of a woman who's only part of our lives because of your job. For the first time, I saw a flash of guilt in his eyes. But it was fleeting, quickly masked by frustration. He crossed his arms, his face hardening. You're blowing this out of proportion, he said, his tone curt. If you're so upset, we can always go through the process to change it later. But I thought you'd be more understanding. Understanding? I repeated, incredulous. You changed the name of our child without asking me. And you expect me to just understand? He sighed heavily, his patience clearly wearing thin. I'm exhausted, okay? I had a long day. Can we not do this right now? But I couldn't let it go. How could I? This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a minor decision. It was our son's name, something that should have symbolized our love, our partnership. And instead, it felt like it was tainted. Like he had taken something precious and twisted it. No, we can't just let this go, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Because this isn't just about the name. And you know it. This is about trust. This is about you making decisions without me. And then expecting me to just fall in line. He looked away, his face set in an unreadable mask. For a moment, I hoped he'd apologize, that he'd realize the gravity of what he'd done. But instead, he just muttered, I didn't think you'd make such a big deal out of it. I felt my heart sink. I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me, like they were squeezing the air out of the room. It wasn't just disappointment anymore. It was a growing sense of betrayal that rooted itself deep within me. How could he sit there, look me in the eye, and act like I was overreacting? Like the name change was a trivial detail. Something that didn't matter? Every moment we had shared over the years. Every plan we made together. All of it suddenly felt flimsy. Like an illusion I'd built up in my mind. I thought we were in this together. That I could trust him. That we would always work as a team. But now, here I was, facing the reality that he had chosen to make this monumental decision without me. It was a glimpse into a side of him I hadn't expected, and one I wasn't sure I could reconcile with. I didn't say anything further that night. Not because I didn't have more to say, but because I needed a moment to process it all. I retreated to our bedroom, my mind racing with questions. How long had he been planning this? Why was he so dismissive of my feelings? And why his boss's last name, of all things? As I lay awake, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioner, a chilling thought crossed my mind. What if there was more to this? His choice wasn't just some spur-of-the-moment decision. He had gone out of his way to make it official. To ensure it was documented and permanent. Why? I didn't want to admit it. But something about the name choice gnawed at me. He'd never even mentioned his boss in a way that suggested admiration, respect, or anything close to an ideal worth naming our child after. In fact, he barely spoke about her at all. And now her name was tied to our son, memorialized on a document that was supposed to be about us. I found myself scanning through memories, trying to piece together any detail I might have missed. Times when he'd stayed late at work or missed family gatherings because of last-minute projects. Instances where he'd seemed unusually tense, irritable, or secretive. The countless times I'd let it slide, trusting that he had a good reason, that it was just the demands of his job. And then there was his reaction to my confrontation earlier. The defensiveness, the dismissal. It wasn't the response of someone who was just tired from a long day or blindsided by my frustration. It felt like he was hiding something, guarding it with a shield of indifference. The seeds of doubt that had been planted in my mind took root, spreading, weaving into every thought. The next morning, as he headed out to work, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease. I couldn't look at him without seeing that birth certificate in my mind. The name glaring up at me like an accusation. For the first time in our relationship, I felt like I didn't know him at all. I spent the day trying to go through my usual routine, but nothing felt normal. Every bottle I prepared, every quiet moment I spent with our son, only served as a painful reminder of what had been taken from me. It was supposed to be a name that honored my grandfather, a name that carried a legacy I had dreamed of passing down. Instead, it felt like a stranger's name, an intrusion on something sacred. I wanted answers, something concrete to latch onto. And as much as I didn't want to jump to conclusions, my mind kept wandering to the possibility I had been avoiding. What if there was more to his relationship with his boss? What if this name change wasn't a careless decision, but a calculated one? The thought chilled me to my core. I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. I needed clarity, closure, whatever that might look like. I started reaching out to a few friends and colleagues who knew my husband's workplace well, casually asking about his boss, about any rumors or stories that might shed light on their relationship. It felt like a betrayal, digging into his life like this. But after what he had done, I felt justified. I was no longer operating on blind trust. I needed to see things for what they were. As I continued searching for any hint, any thread of truth, I felt an unsettling sense of guilt battling with my need for answers. But every time I thought about letting it go, I remembered the casual shrug, the way he had brushed off my feelings like they were inconsequential. The knowledge that he'd altered something so deeply personal, without a hint of remorse, weighed on me. I knew this was just the beginning. Whatever I uncovered, it would change everything: our trust, our relationship, the future we had envisioned for our son. And as terrifying as that prospect was, I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Days passed in a blur, each one tainted with suspicion and resentment. Every interaction I had with my husband now felt clouded by an undercurrent of doubt. I couldn't stand looking at him without remembering the birth certificate or hearing his dismissive response replay in my mind. It was like a wedge had been driven between us, one I was beginning to suspect wouldn't be easily removed. I had reached out to a friend who worked in the same industry, hoping for some insight into what might be going on. She had connections at his company, and though I felt a bit guilty involving her in something so personal, I couldn't keep going around in circles with my thoughts. I needed answers, and she was one of the few people I trusted not to judge me for looking deeper into this. After a couple of days, she finally got back to me. She said she didn't know his boss personally, but she'd heard enough stories through the grapevine. According to her, his boss was notorious for her intense, demanding nature. She didn't have a reputation for being easy to work with, but people respected her drive. That, in itself, didn't explain why he'd name our son after her. As we dug deeper, however, my friend hesitated before dropping something that made my heart sink. Rumor had it, his boss wasn't just tough on her team, she was particularly close with some of them. Especially the ones who put in the extra hours, who took on projects beyond their scope. I felt my stomach twist, realizing my husband had been staying late more often than usual for months. It wasn't just regular work hours. He'd become practically a stranger in his own home, spending most of his time at the office or out of reach. My mind raced, connecting dots that seemed far too coincidental. The name change, the late nights, the dismissive responses, all signs pointed to something deeper than just a questionable work relationship. If I had been trying to convince myself that I was reading too much into things before, that hope was quickly evaporating. I didn't confront him immediately. I needed more, something tangible, before I opened a door that I knew would likely change everything. So I began looking closer at his behavior, even if it made me feel like I was crossing a line. I skimmed through our shared calendar, checking for patterns, noting the meetings that didn't quite make sense, the unexplained gaps that seemed to correlate with the days he came home especially late. It felt surreal to even be in this position, to be investigating my own husband. I had always thought we were different, That our relationship was built on a solid foundation of trust and mutual respect. But that belief felt like a distant memory now. Every step I took felt like peeling back a layer of a reality I hadn't wanted to see. One that had been hiding in plain sight. Then came the turning point. One evening, I was putting our son to bed when I noticed my husband had left his work laptop on the kitchen counter. It was unlike him, he usually kept it close. Especially after I'd brought up the name issue. I couldn't resist the temptation. I waited until he went to shower. And with shaking hands, I opened the laptop, not even sure what I was looking for. I wasn't a tech expert, but I knew enough to check his recent files and emails. Scrolling through, I noticed an unusual email chain with his boss. One that he hadn't mentioned. The subject line was vague. And at first glance, it looked like just another work-related message. But as I read through it, a sense of betrayal washed over me. The emails were written with a level of familiarity that went beyond professional. She had signed off with a casual nickname. Something endearing and familiar. And one particular message referenced an inside joke between them. One that made my stomach turn. It was then that I saw an attachment titled, Weekend Plans. I clicked on it, my heart pounding as I waited for it to open. The attachment contained a series of event invites to local restaurants and even a hotel reservation that I couldn't explain away. According to the dates, these reservations lined up with weekends he'd told me he had, work retreats, or team building exercises. I was numb, but my mind was racing. I tried to reason it out. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions, seeing things that weren't there. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I knew I couldn't deny what I was looking at. The pieces of the puzzle were forming a picture I had been afraid to acknowledge. When he came out of the shower, I was still standing in the kitchen, clutching the counter for support. I didn't confront him then and there, I couldn't. I needed time to process, to figure out my next steps. I'd never been more certain that something was deeply wrong in our marriage. But the betrayal felt too raw, too new, for me to handle it without breaking down. In the days that followed, I pulled away from him, keeping interactions minimal. He seemed to sense my distance. But I didn't care to hide it. I was done pretending everything was fine. Done making excuses for his behavior. The walls I'd built around myself were becoming stronger each day. A defense mechanism against the reality I was beginning to accept. There would come a time to confront him. To lay everything out and demand answers. But for now, I needed to protect myself. To gather my strength for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. Days went by with the weight of suspicion growing heavier, pressing down with every silent moment between us. I no longer felt at ease in my own home. And that constant feeling of tension wasn't just affecting me. I could feel the strain on our baby. Who, despite being so little, somehow sensed that something wasn't right. Every time I looked at my husband, my mind filled with the cold reality of what I'd uncovered. Yet I hadn't yet confronted him. And that indecision was wearing me down. The birth certificate, his boss's name on it, the quiet betrayal, it all became impossible to ignore. And then, as if fate decided to push me toward resolution, I received a text from an unknown number one afternoon. It was a co-worker of his. Someone I'd met at a few company gatherings. She was reaching out, as a friend. As she put it, to inform me she'd seen my husband and his boss out for dinner the night before. She thought I knew, thought it was a business dinner, and wanted to share that she found it strange they were together, given everything. That was the moment my simmering anger turned to resolve. He came home late that night, still carrying the faint smell of some high-end cologne I didn't recognize. It was a small detail, but in that moment, it felt like the last straw. I waited until he put his keys down, glancing up at me with an uneasy look that told me he knew something was off. I didn't waste a second, the words just spilled out. Blunt and raw. Why did you put her name on our son's birth certificate? He blinked, taken aback, and I could see the gears turning as he tried to come up with an explanation. But I had the upper hand. I had no intention of letting him wriggle out of this. I'm serious. This isn't something you just forgot to mention. I've already called the hospital. So I know it was no mistake. And before you tell me you don't know what I'm talking about. I've seen your emails, your so-called weekend plans. So don't even try to gaslight me. Just tell me the truth. A heavy silence hung in the air, my heart pounding as I waited for him to speak. To either confirm my fears or deny it all. When he finally spoke, it was with a level of detachment that cut through me like ice. It's not what you think. She's just a mentor, someone I respect a lot. I thought it was a strong name. The words felt hollow. A mentor? Someone he respected? He still didn't realize that using her last name was not just an issue of poor judgment, it was an insult. A dismissal of everything we had once built together. Our child, our future, all of it tainted by a decision that reeked of betrayal. You thought using her name for our son was a good idea? You thought this woman was important enough to push aside the name we had planned? The name that meant so much to me? He flinched, then let out a sigh as though he was tired of the whole situation. A look of exhaustion washing over his face. I didn't mean it like that. He said quietly. I was confused. Things have been stressful. Don't give me that. I snapped, barely able to contain the rage bubbling up. Confused? You chose her over us. You've been sneaking around, staying late, going on weekend trips, and all of it just coincidentally happened around the same time you thought it'd be okay to name our son after her? He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes downcast. I could see him struggling to keep his composure. But my sympathy had run out. He wasn't the victim here, I was. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. She helped me through some things. Things I didn't feel I could share with you because I didn't want to burden you while you were pregnant. Oh, spare me, I shot back, the anger now a full flame. You didn't want to burden me? We've been married for 5 years. I gave birth to our child. But you still don't trust me enough to handle whatever crisis you're going through? He opened his mouth to argue. But no words came out. His silence was the answer I needed. Whatever his reasons, whatever his excuses, the bottom line was clear. He had chosen someone else's presence. Someone else's opinion, over mine, over his own family. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep the tears at bay. This wasn't how I'd envisioned any of this. The life I'd planned, the family we were building, it all seemed so distant now. As if it had been a dream that was fading, slipping through my fingers as reality came crashing down. I want you to leave, I said finally, my voice steady. He looked up, shocked, as though he hadn't anticipated that response. You can stay somewhere else for a while. Go back to her or to whoever else you've been spending all those late nights with. I'm done with the lies. The excuses. All of it. He stared at me, his face an unreadable mask. Before nodding slowly, maybe he realized there was no coming back from this. Or maybe he thought that by leaving, he'd somehow absolve himself of the guilt, the hurt he had caused. As he packed a bag, I stood in the hallway, numb, barely able to process the fact that my marriage was disintegrating before my eyes. He glanced back once before leaving, as if waiting for me to change my mind. But I stood firm, my gaze unwavering as I watched him walk out the door. The silence that followed felt oppressive, suffocating. I had done the right thing, hadn't I? I had stood up for myself, for my child, for the life I deserved. But as I stood there in the empty apartment, doubts crept in, and I wondered if I had the strength to face what came next. The hours after he left felt strangely still, like the quiet that follows a storm. I wandered through the apartment, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar silence. But it was relentless. Everything here was tinged with memories of the life we'd built together. Now lying fractured and incomplete, my eyes landed on the nursery. The tiny crib, the soft blue blankets, the mobile that spun quietly above our son's sleeping form. I picked him up, holding him close as he slept, inhaling the faint smell of baby lotion. In that moment, I promised him, and myself, that we would find a way through this. That I would be strong for him, no matter what came next. My family and close friends hadn't yet known the full details, only snippets I'd managed to share between shaky breaths and bottled-up tears. But in the days that followed, I found myself telling them the truth. About the name, the betrayal, the decision I had made to ask him to leave. It was exhausting and cathartic all at once. The words spilled out, taking shape, and I felt a weight lift as each story left me. My mother held me, my friends listened, And together they became a support I hadn't realized I'd need so deeply. It didn't stop the ache, though. Every morning, I woke to an emptiness that went beyond the physical absence of him in the apartment. It was the absence of the life I thought we were creating. I struggled to understand how it had crumbled so quickly. How could I have spent so many years with someone devoted to building a future, only to find out he had jeopardized it all with a choice as absurd as putting his boss's name on our son's birth certificate? In the quiet hours, I cycled through every moment, trying to piece together how I could have been so blind, so naive. I wanted desperately to blame him entirely, but I had to face the uncomfortable truth. Somewhere along the way, I had let myself ignore the signs. I had been so focused on holding us together, so convinced of our shared future, that I hadn't stopped to ask myself if he was truly committed to the same path. The hardest part was acknowledging that I had ignored my own needs and boundaries for the sake of a man who would, in the end, so easily put someone else's influence above me. I began the paperwork to legally change our son's name, reclaiming the honor I had meant to bestow from the start. The process felt like an act of reclaiming my own narrative, restoring the story I had once planned for my child. It took weeks, and with each form signed, I felt a sense of quiet pride. I was doing this for my son, ensuring that he would grow up with a name that symbolized family, resilience, and love, not a name tainted by betrayal. And then came the texts from my husband, though I had almost expected them. At first, they were apologetic, filled with explanations and promises to make it right, assurances that I was the one he truly loved. But the apologies quickly turned to pleas, and then demands. He accused me of overreacting, of abandoning him in his moment of crisis. He argued that I was depriving our son of his father, that by choosing this path, I was the one breaking our family apart. I wanted to defend myself, to respond with all the hurt he had caused, to unleash the anger I felt each time I replayed his betrayal in my mind. But I didn't. Instead, I let silence speak for me, allowing the distance between us to make clear that I would not be swayed. Not by apologies, nor by guilt. I was finished compromising myself for someone who had failed to respect the very core of our relationship. As days turned into weeks, I found moments of peace creeping in. They were small: a quiet afternoon walk with my son, laughter shared with friends over coffee, the warm support from my mother's steady hand on my shoulder. These were fragments of the life I was slowly piecing together. I was still healing, still wrestling with anger, but I was also discovering a sense of strength that I hadn't known was there. One night, as I was putting my son to bed, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time, I allowed myself to picture a future without my husband. A future where I stood on my own. It wasn't an easy vision to accept, but it was mine, and the more I let myself imagine it, the more it felt like the only path forward. In that future, I saw a woman who knew her worth, who refused to be defined by anyone else's mistakes. I thought about my son, about the lessons I wanted him to learn from all of this. I wanted him to grow up knowing that love requires respect, that relationships are built on trust, and that he should never settle for less than someone who cherishes him for who he is. If I was to teach him these things, I knew I had to embody them myself, to live the example I wanted to set for him. So, in that stillness, I made another promise, not just to my son, but to myself. I would not let betrayal be the ending of my story. I would rebuild, not for anyone else, but because I deserved it. And I knew, somehow, that no matter how long it took, I would be okay. The final weeks of sharing this space with him passed in an emotional blur. I could feel his lingering presence in each corner of the house. A mix of nostalgia and resentment threading through each room. Every interaction we had felt like a chore, and I kept my responses to a minimum, each one a reminder that I was holding firm. Even then, he continued trying to sway me, his apologies often sounding like bargaining chips more than heartfelt acknowledgments. He was willing to make it right, as he put it, if I'd simply move on and let this all slip into some forgotten past. But every attempt was hollow, a temporary fix, and the person he wanted me to forgive simply didn't exist anymore. If he ever had. Our conversations now circled around the logistics of our separation. We discussed legal details with forced politeness. The words uncomfortably sterile. Somehow, it felt like each agreement we reached was another layer of closure, necessary, if painful. We decided he would find a new place within the month. But I insisted on keeping the house. The one place I wanted as an anchor in the storm. It wasn't the walls or the furniture that mattered, it was my son's room. His tiny crib, and the comforting familiarity of home that I needed to hold on to. My family, my rock through all this, kept close by, providing me with endless reassurance and support. My mother often stayed over to help with the baby and keep me company, filling the silence with her warmth. And my sister, the one who had advised me to let this go, eventually softened her stance, realizing the depth of the hurt I was wading through. Even she began to recognize that my decision to divorce wasn't rash or reactive, it was self-preservation. I leaned on my friends, too, in a way I never had before. Each of them rallied around me, bringing laughter back into my days and supporting me in ways that reminded me of who I was beyond this heartbreak. It was strange, in a sense, how my community showed up so strongly for me. Every text, every visit felt like a lifeline, a reminder that I was not alone in this. In those days, I rediscovered an independence I'd nearly forgotten. With each task I took on myself, whether arranging the day-to-day for my son or managing our finances, I felt a small, stubborn pride building within me. It was as if life was forcing me to reassemble myself, piece by piece, from the inside out. But still, there were moments when grief would hit hard, knocking me down with a force I couldn't predict. On those nights, I'd hold my son a little closer, wondering how I'd ever explain this to him, how I'd tell him about the love and loss that defined his early days. And yet, I'd also remind myself that in breaking free, I was setting an example of strength and resilience, of not settling for anything less than respect. When he finally moved out, it was a day of strange contradictions. Relief washed over me, yes, but so did an unexpected sorrow. This had been my life for so long that letting it go felt like abandoning a part of myself. But I held my ground. As he walked out, carrying his last box, there was a weight lifted, a space created not just in our home but in my heart. From that moment, I focused on creating a new life for us, grounded in love and security, free from distrust. I threw myself into mothering with a fierceness that surprised me. Every smile, every tiny milestone with my son became a testament to our resilience. Proof that we could not only survive but thrive. As the days passed, the fear of the unknown softened, replaced by an unexpected optimism. I began to dream again. Little plans and hopes for a future that didn't revolve around anyone else's validation. It wasn't always easy, and it didn't always feel complete. But it was mine, and for the first time in what felt like years, that was enough. In the months following his departure, the house settled into a new rhythm. With each passing day, I felt my son and I carving out a life that was uniquely ours. Every routine we created, every small ritual, like our morning walks or the bedtime story I read to him, even though he was still too young to understand, felt like a small victory. A testament to my resilience and growth. At first, I had braced myself for the difficulties of single parenting, but I quickly found a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I juggled responsibilities, coordinated childcare, and managed my job, all while figuring out who I was on my own terms. It wasn't seamless, but it was undeniably mine. In that way, the weight of single parenthood felt oddly liberating. There was no longer anyone's opinion to consider except my own. No expectations but the ones I set for myself and my child. But despite my best efforts to keep focused on the future, there were moments when the past would creep back in, gnawing at me with unresolved questions. I wondered how he was handling the fallout from his decision, whether he regretted the betrayal that had torn us apart. But I quickly realized those thoughts served no purpose, they only brought the hurt back into focus. And each time I drifted into that mental territory, I'd remind myself that I had already closed that chapter. I didn't need answers from him to find my way forward. My family continued to be my unwavering support. My mother often remarked on how proud she was, though I could sense her quiet heartbreak for the dreams she once had for us as a family. She and my sister had both shown me endless patience, love, and kindness, stepping in whenever I needed an extra hand or a compassionate ear. Knowing they were there reassured me during moments of doubt, reminding me of the unconditional love that truly mattered. My friends, too, continued to be my lifeline. One evening, as we sat around my dining table, one of them asked if I was ready to start dating again. The question caught me off guard. I hadn't even considered it, the very thought seemed distant, almost surreal. For the longest time, the idea of trusting someone again felt like an impossibility. But, as they nudged me, teasingly, with reminders of the old me, the one who had believed so deeply in love, I realized that maybe one day, I could be that person again. Not now, not yet, but someday. For now, my focus was on building a foundation that my son and I could rely on. One that was secure and free from shadows of the past. I dove back into my work with a newfound dedication. Work had become more than a paycheck, it was a source of stability. A place where I could channel my ambitions and talents. Each accomplishment there felt like a step forward. A reminder that I was capable. That I could provide a good life for my child. And then, gradually, peace began to replace the chaos that had dominated the months before. The bitterness and disappointment I once carried toward my ex began to fade, replaced by a determination to let go entirely. I didn't need to hold on to the anger anymore. It only kept me tethered to a past I was ready to leave behind. Instead, I chose to focus on gratitude, for my family, for my friends, and, most importantly, for the inner strength I had found through this experience. One quiet evening, as I rocked my son to sleep, watching his peaceful face in the dim light, I was overcome with an indescribable sense of calm. I realized that, despite everything, I was content. This wasn't the life I'd envisioned, but it was one I was proud of, one I had fought for. In that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. I had chosen myself, my son, and our future, a future filled with possibility, hope, and the kind of love that couldn't be broken. The journey to true forgiveness surprised me with how complicated, yet liberating, it would be. After months of navigating this new life and beginning to feel at ease, I realized that forgiveness was the final, and perhaps hardest, step in my healing, not for him, for me, for my son, and for the kind of peace I wanted to hold on to. When I first learned about my ex-husband's betrayal, I was consumed with anger and confusion. It was as if the entire foundation of my life had crumbled underfoot, leaving me to rebuild from the rubble. Forgiving him seemed impossible, in my mind. It felt like surrendering or excusing his actions. But with time and reflection, I began to see forgiveness differently, not as condoning the hurt, but as releasing myself from the pain I'd been carrying. I knew if I didn't let go of the resentment, it would forever weigh me down, creating a bitterness I didn't want my son to inherit. Slowly, I allowed myself to process everything in small pieces. I acknowledged the sadness, felt the anger fully, and accepted the reality of what had happened. Each time the memories of betrayal resurfaced, instead of dwelling on them, I would recognize them, release them, and remind myself that they no longer had power over my life. It was an exhausting but necessary ritual, and with each passing day, I grew lighter. Eventually, I was able to look back on my relationship with something resembling understanding. I couldn't fully comprehend his choices or justify them, but I could accept that they reflected his journey, his decisions, and his weaknesses, not mine. Somewhere along the way, I even began to wish him peace in his own life, recognizing that while his actions had hurt me, they had also freed me. Without his betrayal, I might never have had the courage to move forward, to build the life I was now creating. My friends noticed the change in me before I did. They'd tell me I seemed more at ease, or that I had a new glow. Even my mom, who'd spent sleepless nights worrying over my heartbreak, mentioned that I looked lighter, as if a weight had lifted. It was a hard-won compliment, but it filled me with pride. I was becoming the woman I wanted to be, stronger, more self-assured, and untethered by the past. One day, while organizing a box of old photos and keepsakes I'd put away after the split, I stumbled upon our wedding photo. In that picture, my ex-husband and I were beaming, full of dreams and promise. Oblivious to what lay ahead, I felt a brief pang of nostalgia. Not for him, but for the person I'd been back then. I took a moment to honor her. The young woman who had loved so fiercely and believed so deeply. I thanked her for giving me that experience, for helping me grow, and then, gently, I closed the box. It was the first time I could look at that photo without bitterness. Instead, it served as a reminder of where I'd been and how far I'd come. I didn't need to hate him, nor did I need to hold on to the anger to feel justified in my choices. Forgiveness, I found, was about setting myself free, about making peace with the chapters that had come before, so I could fully embrace the life ahead. After that, I was more open to new possibilities than ever before. I wasn't searching for love, I was rediscovering it within myself. In the quiet moments with my son, in the laughter with my friends, and in the fresh dreams I was nurturing, I knew my life wasn't defined by the heartbreak I'd endured but by the strength, resilience, and grace I'd found on the other side. And in that realization, I found a happiness that was entirely my own. The realization that I was truly free felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a shadow. This entire journey, what started as heartbreak, disappointment, and anger, had transformed me in ways I hadn't expected. The person I was becoming was a version of myself I could genuinely respect and, dare I say, even admire. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was growing, living, and choosing each step forward with intention. One of the biggest shifts came in how I started defining my self-worth. I had spent so much of my past relationship defining myself as a partner, measuring my value against someone else's perception and approval. When my ex-husband's betrayal tore through those beliefs, it felt as if I had lost part of my identity. But piece by piece, I was building something new, a foundation based on my own worth, my own values, and what truly mattered to me. It wasn't dependent on anyone else. And that realization was the most freeing of all. In this new chapter, I started embracing the things I'd let fall away. I picked up hobbies I hadn't touched in years, went on hikes, and reconnected with the creativity I'd buried under the weight of obligations and responsibilities. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. It was like I'd been given permission to just be me. And I wasn't going to waste a moment of it. My son became my constant inspiration. Watching him grow and experiencing his small triumphs each day reminded me that I was building something for both of us. We were our own family now. And that meant creating traditions, cultivating joy, and embracing the quiet moments we shared together. His laughter filled our home, replacing the echoes of arguments and resentments. In those moments, I saw the beauty of our life. And it was enough. It was more than enough. I knew, too, that I was ready to open my heart to other relationships. But with a new awareness. I wasn't searching for completion or validation. I was content, even excited, to meet people who would add to my life without defining it. If someone came along who valued the same things, who saw the strength and independence I'd cultivated, I would be open to that. But I wasn't waiting or holding my breath. I was whole, and that was enough. As I reflected on all that had happened, I recognized the gift in the pain. This entire experience, as excruciating as it had been, had propelled me toward a version of myself I might never have found otherwise. I felt grateful, not for the betrayal, but for the growth that came from it. I had discovered resilience I didn't know I had, strength that felt limitless, and a clarity about who I was and what I wanted. As I closed this chapter, I held a deep gratitude for the lessons learned and the peace I'd found. My journey was far from over, but I was no longer defined by what I'd lost. Instead, I was defined by what I had gained: self-respect, inner peace, and a fierce, unbreakable love for myself and my son. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that whatever lay ahead, I was ready. I was ready because I had finally found my own strength.